It sold for $240 million yesterday.
Harland Sanders, or Colonel Sanders as he'd later be known, was born on a farm in Indiana on September 9th, 1890. He came from very humble beginnings, and at just 5 years old, his father passed away. In order for the family to survive, his mother was forced to take on lots of odd jobs like sewing and working at a canning factory. This meant from a very young age, Sanders had to look after his 2 younger siblings, which led him to practicing his cooking from as young as 7 years old. He'd often stay up late developing his skills, and thus began to become a very good cook. At age 10, Sanders got a job working on a farm, but ended up getting fired because he spent so much time with the animals instead of actually doing the jobs he was meant to. His mother was furious he'd lost the job. She told him, "You're just no good. Here I am, left alone with you 3 children to support, and you won't even work enough so somebody will keep you. I guess I'll never be able to count on you." Sanders felt ashamed and vowed in that moment he would make a success of his life. However, shortly after this, Sanders' life actually got much worse, as his mother remarried to a violent man who treated his new stepkids terribly. He was very clear about the fact he didn't want them, and so at age 12, Sanders moved out of his home and went to make his own way in the world. He managed to get a job at another farm, and would get up before dawn to feed the animals, then go to school during the day, and take on any other work he could get in the evenings. Unfortunately, it was all too much, and since Sanders hated school, in particular algebra, he dropped out at just 13 years old, merely a few weeks into the 7th grade. Sanders would go on to try a huge variety of different jobs in his early years. These included becoming a streetcar conductor, an insurance salesman, tire salesman, steamboat operator, midwife, secretary, and a carriage painter. He even had a brief stint in the US Army as a soldier and served in Cuba when he was just 15 years old. Although this wasn't how he became known as a colonel, as he was only in the army for about 6 months before getting discharged, most likely because he was found to have been underage. By the time he turned 18, Sanders got married and then went on to have 3 kids. Of course, he needed money to support his family and decided to try and get a more professional job working in the legal field. He took a law course that was done via mail, but his law career ended when he got into a courtroom brawl with one of his own clients, which destroyed his reputation. So, Sanders later got a job working at the railroad, but when he got fired from that as well, his wife Josephine decided to leave him. She reportedly gave away all their furniture and household goods and took their kids back to her parents' house. Sanders was distraught by this. He'd not only lost his job, he'd now seemingly lost his family. He went over to their house and hid in the woods with a plan to essentially kidnap his kids and take them home with him when they came outside to play. But thankfully at the last moment, he instead decided to speak with his father-in-law, who made him see sense, and so Sanders instead went inside to make things right with his wife and eventually got back together with her. However, Sanders just couldn't catch a break, because even that would end in tragedy. In 1947, Sanders divorced his wife after one of their sons died at just 20 years old. Their marriage had fallen apart soon after because they both struggled to come to terms with the grief. So, as you can see, the first half of Harland Sanders' life was plagued with failures and sadness. But luckily, a very unlikely development was about to change his life forever. At age 40, Sanders got a job in Kentucky with Shell, running a gas station. And to make extra money, Sanders decided to make meals for his customers from the back room, given that he was a skilled cook. He put out a single table that seated 6 people and sold ham, steaks, string beans, and hot biscuits. Fried chicken initially wasn't on the menu though, as it took too long to prepare, about 30 to 35 minutes, so he couldn't keep up with the demand. He knew that deep frying was one way to cook it faster, but this generally made the chicken way too dry, crusty, and unevenly cooked. But then Sanders made a massive breakthrough. You see, around this time, pressure cookers were becoming more widely sold, and although they were typically used for vegetables, Sanders decided to try it for chicken. It took a lot of experimentation to find the right settings and balance of time, pressure, fat, and filtration, perfection, but eventually, Sanders figured out a way to cook chicken in just 8 or 9 minutes, while still keeping the chicken's flavor. And it only got even better when Sanders tried a new seasoning blend, which he'd later call his secret blend of 11 herbs and spices. Very quickly, the chicken became a bestseller and was a massive hit with travelers passing through. To help increase sales further, Sanders advertised his gas station food by painting ads on barn doors in the local area, which proved to be great marketing. However, a competitor nearby called Matt Stewart was extremely annoyed by Sanders' aggressive promotion and began painting over the signs Sanders had put up. Sanders warned him he'd shoot him if he didn't stop, but Stewart carried on painting over his ads anyway. So Sanders, along with 2 managers of the gas station he operated, went to pay Matt Stewart a visit. However, when Stewart saw them coming, he immediately pulled out his own gun and fired. The bullet narrowly missed Sanders and instead hit one of the managers Sanders had gone with. He died immediately. Sanders grabbed his own gun and returned fire, hitting Stewart in the shoulder. All men were arrested by the police after this shootout, and Stewart got 18 years in prison for murder, while Sanders didn't serve any jail time as he'd fired in self-defense. It was an extremely close call for Sanders, but the end result was his competitor was now behind bars, leaving him to dominate the local area. Sales of his gas station food soared rapidly, especially his fried chicken. He could barely keep up with the demand. In fact, Sanders built up such a reputation that in 1935, the governor of Kentucky, Ruby LaFoon, bestowed him with the honorary title of colonel in recognition of his contributions to the state's cuisine. So, the colonel title was honorary, nothing to do with his military rank, but Sanders still embraced it fully, and from then on he went by Colonel Sanders, with many simply referring to him as the Colonel instead of his real name Harland. That same year, the demand for Colonel Sanders' food meant he needed to move out of the gas station and instead opened up a 142-seat restaurant. It had taken him until his 40s, but he finally seemed to have found success. But soon Sanders' bad luck seemed to have returned, as in 1939 his restaurant burnt down. And by the time it was rebuilt, World War II had broken out, meaning there were no tourists or travelers passing through, which had been his main source of customers, and so he ultimately had to sell the place. But he didn't give up. When the war was over, Sanders started a new restaurant, which was successful until the 50s. But then the next bit of bad news came in the form of a new interstate highway that was being built, which bypassed Sanders' location completely, thus drastically cutting his sales. He was ultimately forced to auction off the business at a loss. And so, at the age of 65, he now had no business and no other income except his savings, and thus had to rely on his social security check of just $105 a month. Now, there is some misinformation online that says Sanders nearly ended his life at this point, but there's actually no evidence of that. In fact, quite the opposite. Sanders was a very determined man, and he wasn't going to give up that easily. He said in his biography, "If I hadn't been 66 years old and had a $105 security check coming in every month, I don't know what I would have done. But for me, it wasn't a matter of giving up, it was just a problem of what to do next." And so, despite being at retirement age, Colonel Sanders was really just getting started, and little did he know, he was on the verge of his biggest breakthrough yet. What about if instead of running a restaurant himself, he could franchise? He'd let other restaurants sell his chicken and charge 4 cents for every chicken sold. So Sanders put a bunch of pressure cookers in his car, along with a big bag of his famous seasoning, and hit the road in his 1946 Ford. His plan was to travel all across the United States, finding potential franchisee restaurants. But it certainly wasn't an easy life. He had to live out of his car, and it was exhausting traveling non-stop. When he came across a restaurant he thought looked suitable, he'd convince the owner to let him cook his chicken for their employees, and if they liked it, he'd stay for a few days to cook for their customers, hoping they'd like it so much that the restaurant wanted to become a franchisee of his chicken. For a while, Sanders was met with rejection after rejection. He was reportedly turned down 1,009 times before finally getting someone to agree. How tempting it must have been to quit after 1,000 rejections. But Sanders had just kept going. His first successful franchise came in 1952, when Pete Harmon of South Salt Lake in Utah agreed to sell Sanders' chicken. Harmon owned a large chain of restaurants already, and said his sales tripled in the first year once he began selling the Colonel's Kentucky Fried Chicken recipe. In fact, it was actually this first franchisee, Pete Harmon, who coined the phrase "finger-licking good," which later became the slogan across the whole KFC chain. Within a couple of years, everything had changed, and Sanders didn't need to make those long road trips anymore to find new partners. People started coming to him instead, as word about his chicken spread rapidly across the country. Of course, Sanders didn't share the exact recipe with franchisees, as he was scared competitors would end up copying it, so he sent the spice blend pre-made. Plus, Sanders always seemed to have a talent for marketing, and clearly recognized that the idea of a secret recipe generated a lot more intrigue. By the end of 1963, he'd franchised over 600 outlets across the US and Canada and built a company worth millions. Within a couple of years, that would be 900 outlets, including some in the UK and Japan. His chicken was a huge hit, and the franchise model was a massive success. Sanders had finally made it, and at long last was financially secure. But that is certainly not the end of the story. KFC was thriving. But then one day, a group of entrepreneurs and investors, led by a 29-year-old named John Brown, came to Sanders with an offer. They wanted to buy his business. John had been shocked when he'd learned that KFC didn't even have a sales team, and was simply relying on restaurant owners coming to KFC through word of mouth in order to open up their own KFC franchise. John said to his partners, "If we owned this company, imagine how quickly we could expand it if we were more aggressive with sales." So they made Sanders an offer to buy KFC. Initially, Sanders turned them down. His business was like a child to him, and he was concerned they'd ruin it. But John wouldn't let it go. He upped his offer to buy KFC to $2 million and swore he'd never tamper with the Colonel's recipe and would always maintain a high degree of quality control. He also said he wanted Sanders to stay on as an advisor and ambassador for the company, as he believed having Sanders as the face of the company was one of their biggest marketing assets. So in 1964, Sanders finally agreed to sell his business. He was 73 at this point and figured this would allow him a little more time to enjoy the final stages of his life. Once the sale went through, Sanders was officially a millionaire. Although, in truth, he barely stepped away from KFC at all. Sanders enjoyed being part of publicity campaigns and ended up traveling all over the world for various promotions, as well as making appearances on many different TV ads. He simply leaned into the whole thing, wearing his iconic white suit every day. Meanwhile, John and the other entrepreneurs who'd taken over KFC's management made some important changes that helped the business grow and open many new locations. However, in 1971, John Brown sold the company to a giant food conglomerate, and that's when everything began to change. Unlike John, who'd agreed not to tamper with the Colonel's recipes, the new owners of KFC did not do that. For example, they changed the gravy to a version that was much cheaper and easier to make. A company executive at the time said, "Let's face it, the Colonel's gravy was fantastic, but you had to be a Rhodes Scholar to cook it." KFC were expanding quickly and wanted to streamline, and so basically they'd made some changes. The thing is, Sanders still visited lots of KFC stores himself, and when he tried the new recipe, he said, "My god, that gravy is horrible. They ought not to be allowed to sell it. It's pure wallpaper paste." Sanders wasn't any more complimentary about the chicken either, saying it was nothing but a damn fried dough ball stuck on some chicken. His criticism was so harsh and so public that one KFC franchisee sued him for libel in 1978. But the case was thrown out. However, Sanders was so unhappy with the direction KFC was taking under the new owners, he opened up his own competing restaurant under the name Claudia Sanders, the Colonel's Lady Dinner House. This then led to KFC suing Sanders. In other words, the new owners suing the founder of the company. And it was a bitter lawsuit over the copyright of his name and whether he should be allowed to open a competing business using the Colonel branding. In retaliation, Sanders then attempted to sue the new owners in a separate legal battle, alleging they misused his image in promoting products he hadn't developed. And Sanders was demanding $122 million in damages. Eventually, they settled, and Sanders got paid $1 million, but had to rename his competing restaurant to simply Claudia Sanders Dinner House. And by the way, that restaurant still exists today, and is the only place to get the original Colonel Sanders fried chicken. But still, Sanders was a fighter until the end. But in 1980, he died from acute leukemia, aged 90. He was still working until a month before his death, as he said he had no interest in retiring and sitting around doing nothing. As of today, there are over 25,000 KFC outlets around the world, and it all started with a guy cooking chicken in a gas station. Despite constant failures, rejections, and tragedies, Sanders kept going, started his new business model at 65, and became a millionaire by 74. In the famous words of Colonel Sanders himself, one has to remember that every failure can be a stepping stone to something better.